tomorrow when we talk about polarity management, right? Because a lot of what I've had, NIF has always kind of been based on this notion of, let's set up these approaches. There should be tensions within the approach. Like, okay, I like this part of the approach, but it has an inherent trade-off. So there's tension within the approach. Then there's tensions across the approaches, right? So like I pointed that out with the kind of tension between 3 and 2 in a way, right? That we want it to be, we don't want them to spend so much money and to spend so much time in college, right? But we want them to take all these courses and all these, values and all this kind of other stuff, right? So there's a tension kind of there. So then the question becomes, how do we react to those tensions? So I've been digging a little bit deeper, a little bit in my own research, and polarity management is one thing that came out of it. That's not my term, that's a term that's already out there. But once you recognize there's a tension between two things, right, there's lots of ways to react to that. Sometimes it's recognizing tension and preferring one, right? Okay, we can't have both, and while they're both important, this is going to be more important, so I'm willing to give up. Sometimes it might be kind of the Aristotelian ideal mean, right? Okay, we got the tension, we're going to try to find that perfect balance in the middle somewhere, and then sometimes it's transcending the tension. Maybe it isn't kind of an oppositional tension. Maybe we can have both, right? Green energy is a good example, right? We've always kind of seen a tension between the economy and the environment. Well, green energy is, actually we can create jobs and all this kind of stuff in a green way, right? So STEAM is an example of, instead of saying it's STEM versus everything else, right? It's like, well, how can we kind of incorporate the arts into kind of STEM in a way? Working with high school curriculums, there's a lot of, we want to focus on science and technology, but we don't give the other things. Well, a lot of the reading classes now, they're focusing on reading, but they're reading about science, right? And it's that notion of transcending it. How do we kind of do two things at the same time in a way? So that's part of that reaction in a way because I know part of me, when I focus on tensions, I do feel sometimes that I'm creating these false dichotomies, right? So that's part of what we're wanting to open up. I think sometimes, normally we don't even have the dichotomy. Normally we're only seeing kind of the good of my side and the bad of the other side. It's like a fake dichotomy, right? So at least what I'm trying to create is a fair dichotomy, like, oh, there's an interesting tension there. And I don't want people to get stuck with the tension. I think, recognize that there's lots of ways of reacting to that. That goes back to the wicked problems of a better conversation and spark innovation and creativity. You can spark interesting ways of kind of transcending that tension.
There you go.
But yeah, it was. And the other thing I'll talk about too is, as a facilitator, as I was preparing for this, and my students were just doing this in class, I was just teaching it, there's lots of things to talk about in each of these, right? In a 10, 15 minute, 20 minutes, you're not going to cover all of it, right? That's one of the usefulnesses of my model is you've got 15 tables, right? Across the 15 tables, you're going to cover everything, right? For a facilitator, you're always dealing with kind of depth versus breadth, right? To what degree? There was always someone with a hand up, right? I asked a few, which I'll talk about in a little bit, transition questions, but mainly I kind of let y'all kind of take it in your direction, right? There was with the last one, I threw at that one kind of topic, right? But you're not going to cover everything. You just kind of, you want to spend 15 minutes, you don't want to just focus on one aspect, you want to kind of move along a little bit, but you also have a broader conversation. That's why I think this model works well when you have 15 conversations going on, because then you get the notes from all 15 conversations and you really get a sense of what people are saying, right? But you can also, with a deliberative conversation, you're not going to come to conclusions at the end. Right. So a lot of it, that group might have some ideas, but a lot of it is you go to the data, you make sense of the data, and you go back. And that's one of the reasons I think that the model that I push in terms of universities playing this role, there are national firms that kind of do this work, and they'll kind of come in and run this meeting for your community. But it's so hard for the meeting itself to be it, right? It's more the meeting sparks the conversation, which, that does the cycle. So the more you have universities that are situated in that community long term, right, the more this model kind of works of really kind of sparking that conversation kind of as we go. Right? So that's kind of a quick example. And an actual NIF forum is normally 2 or 3 hours long, right? So we kind of had an hour there just to kind of give you a sense of the kind of conversations, and particularly the sense of the role of the facilitator, right? You probably, in some ways, y'all are a really good audience, right? Y'all are all pretty highly educated. So you're a really easy audience to facilitate in a sense. You all kind of inherently, we talked about the need for balance. Plus, you heard me talk for 2 hours this morning, right? So I probably set the conversation a little bit in a sense. Normally, when it's just the general public walking in, you're going to have a little bit more challenging in some ways. And I would have to intervene a lot more to spark conversation than I did on your own. I probably intervene a lot more than I normally would with this kind of group, just to give you examples of facilitator interventions, right, to kind of set up what we talk about now. They've come up with different options to address it. They've researched those. The engineers have told them the right one. The right one's been recommended to the council. The council has to make a decision, and then they engage the public. And the public can't do anything but complain. I think that's one of the reasons so much of our public process is bad, is they only ask the public at the very end. And at the very end, once there's a specific solution that's been picked, there's winners and losers. And the losers are going to show up to complain, right? So this is a good story that was told. When I went through training by the International Association of Public Participation, IAP2, another great website, has a lot of good information on it. They talk a lot about the move from PR to P2, saying too often kind of communities or universities or cities use public relations, they make the decision and then they're trying to engage the public in terms of selling them a message, right? Versus engaging the public for them to actually participate in the process, right? So they're saying we need to shift to that. And so that example of wait until the end is an example from them. But they had a community that the landfill was filling up, right? So they engaged the community. Well, no, they found out the landfill, so then they go to city staff and say, you know what, we need a new landfill. So city staff kind of researched the landfill, researched kind of the rate of trash being developed, researching the size, figured out how big of a landfill that they needed to kind of cover the next 30 years, then looked at parcels of land in the town, and found like 6 or 7 parcels that they could buy, and then evaluated the kind of that parcel and the wind and all this kind of stuff, and then identified one parcel as the best place to do it, and then announced it to the community that we're building a landfill right here. What do you think happened? Who showed up to that meeting saying, we don't like this idea, right? Everyone that lived next to that landfill. All hell breaks loose, right? So they hire this guy, Doug Sorno, who was my trainer for IAP2, to kind of come in, and they started completely over, right? They said, you know what, let's engage the community with, our landfill is almost filled. We need to do something, right? So they started with a problem in the community rather than with a specific solution, right? So then the community engaged the problem. Part of engaging the problem is the community came up with some ideas that the experts didn't, right? They came up, for example, with the idea of what happens if we cut our trash significantly, right? What happens if we really invest, this is 15, 20 years ago, and really invest in a recycling program, right? So a lot less trash kind of goes there. They also researched that they didn't think about before, what happens if we just kind of bust the trash to the next town, which is a really big landfill, right? They didn't end up going with that solution, but that was an idea that came up with the public that the experts didn't even think about, because again, they were kind of like, right out landfill, we need a new landfill, right? So then they went through the whole process, and they ended up having to have a landfill. It was a much smaller landfill, right? The community, this is kind of goes back to the adaptive change kind of thing. The community, since they're the ones that came up with the lower trash and the recycling, right, supported a big expense to kind of develop a recycling kind of thing, right? And also to kind of develop a really strong public campaign to reduce the amount of trash, right? So their rate of trash. Now, if the experts had come up with that and just told the community, you need to throw that stuff away, it probably wouldn't have happened, right? But the community reacting to the problem, they came up with that idea, they took ownership of it, right? I don't remember the specific numbers of how much, but they had a significant reduction in the amount of trash, and they built up a new recycling program. And then when they actually placed the actual new landfill, again, the people around that landfill were angry, right? But they were part of the process, they understood the need, right? The process was seen as legitimate, right? So, I don't like that it's here, but they didn't, Part of the IAP2 example, in a sense, is this notion that we think we're a democracy, right? We think that a majority, especially a supermajority, if 75% of people are supportive of something, then it will happen, right? But in reality, for big projects, for cities and for counties and universities, one angry person that, especially if they're a lawyer, they know what they're doing, can stop any big project, right? One of the main people I've studied with, basically his dissertation was what major projects for cities to do, like a new road or a new, whatever, new landfill or whatever, that the data was clear. The data showed it was necessary and important, but the public stopped it, right? And he said that the common, and I studied 20 different ones, it was all about the quality of communication, right? It was always like one person or one group can stop something, right? And that's because we wait too long. So that notion of what happens when we engage people from the beginning with a problem and recognize it as a wicked problem. We're not going to solve this. We're not going to come up with a perfect solution, right? There's going to be trade-offs no matter what. But how do we figure this out, right? And you create that legitimacy, and then now you have a decision that's sustainable, those kind of things. And it sparked new things that people hadn't thought of before.